My name is Elena Sinclair and I'm 28 years old. At my sister's engagement party last month, my parents stood before 200 guests and announced that I was a disappointment they could no longer tolerate. They didn't say it in those exact words, they were far too sophisticated for such crude honesty. Instead, they smiled their practiced smiles and delivered what amounted to a character assassination disguised as a family update, explaining to Connecticut's elite that their younger daughter had chosen a path incompatible with family values and would no longer be burdening the family legacy. If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. The words hit like physical blows. Burdening. As if my entire existence was nothing more than dead weight they'd been carrying out of obligation, a charity case they'd finally grown tired of supporting. I sat there in my carefully chosen navy dress, not too flashy, not too dull, the perfect balance of appropriateness that I'd calculated to avoid giving them ammunition, and realized that nothing I could have worn, nothing I could have said or done would have changed this moment. They'd been planning my exile for years, just waiting for the right opportunity to make it public and permanent. No warning, no private conversation, no chance to defend myself or understand what I'd done wrong this time. Just a public humiliation orchestrated with the kind of precision that only people who'd been rehearsing your destruction could achieve. The room full of senators and judges and old money families watching as I was systematically reduced to nothing, demoted from daughter to cautionary tale in real time. They thought I'd accept this final degradation with the same pathetic gratitude I'd shown for every other crumb of attention they'd thrown my way over the years. They expected me to slink away quietly, disappear into whatever small, forgettable life they'd always assumed I deserved. After all, I'd never fought back before. I'd always been the obedient daughter, the one who said, "Yes, mother," and of course, father, even when they were stripping away my dignity piece by piece. But what they didn't realize, what they'd been too arrogant to consider, was that the pathetic, grateful daughter they'd trained me to be had been watching and listening and remembering everything. Every whispered conversation about moving money between accounts. Every forged signature on documents I was never supposed to see. Every lie they'd told to protect their precious reputation while systematically destroying mine. The trust fund they'd stolen from me when I turned 18, replacing my signature with a clumsy forgery that granted them access to my inheritance. The charity donations they'd claimed for tax benefits but never actually made. The employees they'd cheated out of pensions while buying themselves another vacation home. The business partners they'd defrauded with contracts that existed only to line their own pockets. They wanted to erase me? They wanted to stand in front of 200 people and announce that I was such a failure, such an embarrassment, such a fundamental disappointment that even my own parents couldn't bear to claim me anymore? Fine. But when I was finished exposing who they really were, they'd understand what it meant to be the ones left with nothing. Before we dive in, I'm curious, have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever watched siblings receive everything while you got nothing but criticism? Drop a comment below about a time when you felt overlooked. I read every single one, and your stories give me strength to share mine. Growing up in the Sinclair family was like living in a museum where I was the only exhibit nobody wanted to see. The house itself told the story of our family's priorities. Victoria's accomplishments covered every wall, from her first-place science fair ribbon in 3rd grade to her Harvard acceptance letter, professionally framed and lit with museum-quality lighting. My achievements, when they appeared at all, were relegated to hallway corners or my bedroom walls. The pattern started early. When Victoria won the state spelling bee at age 10, my parents threw a celebration dinner and invited the local newspaper. When I placed second in the regional debate championship the same year, Mother mentioned it briefly during cocktail conversation, noting that at least Elena tried her best, even if she didn't quite measure up. That phrase, "didn't quite measure up," became the soundtrack of my childhood. Too emotional, too stubborn, too independent, too passionate about causes that didn't align with the family image. While Victoria learned to smile on command and give perfectly rehearsed answers to adult questions, I asked uncomfortable ones. Why did our charity foundation only help deserving poor people? Why did father's shipping company use tax havens? Why were all the maids and groundskeepers Hispanic, but none of the managers? The questions made everyone uncomfortable, especially Mother. "Elena, dear," she'd say with that particular smile that looked warm but felt like ice, "young ladies don't interrogate. They listen and learn." But I couldn't stop asking questions, couldn't stop seeing the contradictions between what my family preached and what they practiced. It made me the family problem, the daughter who needed to be managed, contained, controlled. The Sinclair estate sprawled across 15 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, with manicured gardens that cost more than most people's houses. The main house was a Georgian colonial that had been in the family for 4 generations, expanded and updated over the decades, but always maintaining its old money elegance. Marble foyers, Persian rugs, oil paintings of ancestors who looked disapproving even in death. I'd grown up here, but standing at the wrought iron gates that September evening, I felt like an intruder at my own family home. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks late, forwarded from my old apartment address through 2 different postal services. It was cream-colored paper with gold embossing, the kind of expensive stationery Mother insisted on for all family communications, with a handwritten note in her precise script. Dress code, formal. Please don't embarrass us. Again. The again was underlined twice. I debated not coming at all. My relationship with my family had been strained for years, ever since I'd graduated from Vassar and announced my intention to work in nonprofit development instead of joining Sinclair Holdings. The look of horror on Father's face had been almost comical, as if I'd declared my intention to become a circus performer or a drug dealer. "Nonprofits are for people who can't make it in the real world," he'd said, his voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that wealthy people mistake for wisdom. "We didn't pay for your education so you could waste it on lost causes." But Victoria had called me personally to ask me to come to the engagement party. "Please, Elena," she'd said, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I know things have been difficult, but you're my sister. This is important to me." So I'd bought a new dress, navy blue, conservative, appropriate, and driven the hour and 15 minutes from my apartment in New Haven to the family estate. The same drive I'd made hundreds of times as a teenager, when I'd attended boarding school 30 minutes away, but still came home every weekend because I missed my family and couldn't understand why they seemed relieved when I left. I wore a simple navy dress, elegant but understated. Nothing that would outshine Victoria, nothing that would give Mother ammunition for her usual critiques about my attention-seeking wardrobe choices. I'd learned early that in the Sinclair family there was a narrow window of appropriateness. Too casual meant you didn't respect the occasion, too formal meant you were trying to steal attention, too colorful meant you lacked sophistication, too plain meant you'd given up on yourself. My heels clicked against the marble steps as I approached the front door, where a hired greeter in a crisp black uniform checked names against a gilded guest list. The list was attached to a mahogany podium that I recognized from other family events. It had been custom-made for my parents' wedding 25 years ago and made appearances at every significant Sinclair gathering since. "Elena Sinclair," I said, watching him scan the list twice with increasing confusion. "Ah yes, here you are," he smiled apologetically, his finger finding my name near the bottom of the page. "You're listed under extended family." "Right this way, miss." Extended family. In the house where I'd lived for 18 years, where my bedroom still technically existed even though Mother had converted it into a guest suite the week after I moved out. The ballroom buzzed with Connecticut's elite, senators, judges, old money families whose names graced museum wings and scholarship funds. The guest list read like a who's who of New England society. The Worthingtons, the Cabots, the Lodges, families whose wealth stretched back to the founding of the country and who wore their ancestry like jewelry. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over clusters of well-dressed guests, all holding champagne flutes filled with Dom Perignon 2012 and discussing summer houses in the Hamptons, sailing seasons in Nantucket, and charity board positions that came with significant social status but minimal actual responsibility. I recognized most faces from charity galas and country club events, people who'd watched me grow up but now seemed to look through me entirely. Mrs. Pemberton from the garden club, who used to compliment my piano recitals, now examined her manicure when I walked past. Judge Morrison, who'd once told my father I was sharp as a tack and would go far in this world, suddenly found the ceiling architecture fascinating when our eyes met. The social geometry of wealth is precise and unforgiving. I could feel my demotion in real time, the way conversations paused when I approached and resumed after I passed, the way smiles became more strained and eye contact more fleeting. Word of my difficult phase had clearly circulated through the appropriate channels. Victoria stood at the center of it all, radiant in a cream-colored designer gown that probably cost more than my annual rent. The dress was custom Vera Wang, I could tell from the signature draping and the way it moved like liquid silk as she gestured. Her engagement ring, a 4-carat diamond surrounded by sapphires, caught the light as she gestured animatedly to a group of admirers hanging on her every word. She looked every inch the perfect Sinclair daughter, beautiful, poised, effortlessly elegant in the way that only comes from a lifetime of professional preparation for public life. Her honey blonde hair was swept into an intricate updo that had probably taken 3 hours to perfect, and her makeup was applied with the kind of skill that costs $500 an hour. Beside her, James Worthington III smiled that practiced smile of old money and political ambition. Tall, handsome in a clean-cut way that suggested yacht clubs and tennis lessons, he was exactly the kind of man Mother had always envisioned for Victoria. His family's political connections stretched back generations. His grandfather had been a senator, his father served as an ambassador, and James himself was being groomed for a gubernatorial run in the next election cycle. The perfect match for the perfect daughter. A merger as much as a marriage, combining two powerful New England dynasties into an even more formidable political and financial force. Elena! Victoria's voice carried across the room, cutting through the ambient chatter of 200 conversations. You made it. She glided over with the kind of graceful movement that expensive deportment lessons and years of ballet training create, arms extended for a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough to appear loving for the cameras I noticed positioned discreetly around the room, brief enough to avoid wrinkling her dress or smudging her carefully applied lipstick. You look beautiful, Vic, I said genuinely, forcing warmth into my voice despite the familiar ache in my chest. Congratulations. Thank you, darling. Mother was worried you wouldn't come. Her eyes scanned my dress with the subtle assessment she'd learned from years of Mother's training, and I could practically see her mental checklist: appropriate length, conservative neckline, nothing too attention-grabbing. Navy is so practical. Very you. The word practical landed like a small slap. In Victoria's vocabulary, really in our family's vocabulary, practical was code for uninspired, boring, the kind of choice made by people who'd given up on themselves. Before I could respond, our parents materialized as if summoned by some invisible signal that I'd never learned to recognize. Margaret Sinclair, my mother, approached with her signature smile, the one that looked warm in photographs but felt like winter wind. At 55, she was still stunning in that carefully maintained way of women who treated aging like a personal failure. Her silver hair was pulled into an elegant chignon that had probably taken 2 hours to achieve, and her black Chanel suit, the same one she'd worn to 3 charity galas this season, screamed understated wealth to anyone who knew how to read the signals. Elena, she said, offering her cheek for an air kiss while simultaneously pulling back just enough to make the gesture feel performative rather than affectionate. How unexpected of you to join us. Not nice. Unexpected. As if my presence at my own sister's engagement party was somehow presumptuous. My father, Richard Sinclair, stood slightly behind her like a well-dressed shadow, checking his Patek Philippe watch with the impatience of someone whose time was perpetually more valuable than everyone else's. At 60, he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd inherited a multi-million-dollar shipping empire and spent decades expanding it, but he'd never quite learned to look comfortable in social situations that didn't revolve around business. The speeches start in 10 minutes, he announced to the air somewhere above my head, as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to be in his line of sight. We should gather the family. The family. I noticed how easily that phrase excluded me, even when I was standing right there. I nodded and started to follow them toward the makeshift stage at the front of the ballroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor in what I hoped was a confident rhythm. But Mother's manicured hand touched my arm with the kind of gentle pressure that felt like a leash. "Actually, dear," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my skin crawl, "you'll be much more comfortable at one of the side tables. The front rows are reserved for immediate family and the Worthingtons. You understand?" I understood perfectly. I understood that I was being demoted from daughter to distant relative in real time, in front of 200 people who'd watched me grow up. I understood that even at my sister's engagement party, my place was in the shadows, watching from the margins like some kind of family ghost. "Of course," I managed, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning in my throat. "I wouldn't want to be in the way." Mother's smile brightened with what looked like relief. "You've always been so understanding, Elena. So accommodating." There it was. The backhanded compliment that made my compliance sound like a character flaw, as if standing up for myself would have been selfish and inappropriate. As if accepting mistreatment was actually a virtue that reflected well on my upbringing. I found my assigned table in the back corner, tucked behind a floral arrangement so large it blocked the view of the stage. My table mates were distant cousins and family friends, nice people, but clearly relegated to the same social purgatory as me. The microphone crackled to life, and my father's voice filled the room. "Good evening, friends. Margaret and I are thrilled to welcome you to celebrate a momentous occasion, the engagement of our daughter Victoria to James Worthington III. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I clapped too, muscle memory overriding the growing knot in my stomach. "Victoria has always been the light of our lives," he continued, his voice warm with genuine pride. "From her Harvard MBA to her work at the foundation, she embodies everything the Sinclair name represents: excellence, integrity, and commitment to family." The words hit like individual arrows. Everything the Sinclair name represents. As if I'd never existed, never graduated summa cum laude from Vassar, never spent 2 years volunteering in Guatemala before starting my nonprofit work. "Tonight also marks a significant transition for Sinclair Holdings," my father announced, his tone shifting to something more formal, more final. "Effective immediately, Victoria will be joining the board of directors and taking over as vice president of operations." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Victoria beamed, stepping closer to the microphone. "We've also made the difficult decision," my father continued, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a blade, "to restructure our family involvement in the company. Moving forward, we'll be focusing our resources and legacy on those family members who share our vision and values." My hands went cold around my champagne flute. This means we'll no longer be including Elena in family business matters or our personal estate planning. While we wish her well in her chosen path, her lifestyle and career choices don't align with the Sinclair legacy we're working to preserve. The ballroom fell silent. Not the reverent quiet of a sacred moment, but the shocked hush of a social bomb detonating in real time. I could feel eyes turning toward my corner table, some curious, others pitying, a few filled with the guilty relief of people grateful not to be in my position. I didn't stand. I didn't gasp or cry or make a scene. I sat perfectly still, my grandmother's pearl earrings heavy against my neck, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Victoria's face had gone pale, her earlier radiance dimmed by obvious discomfort. She looked toward my table once, briefly, before James took her hand and whispered something in her ear. "Now," my father concluded with a return to his jovial tone, "let's toast to Victoria and James and to the bright future ahead for the Sinclair family." 300 people raised their glasses. I raised mine too, because the alternative was causing the scene my parents were clearly hoping to avoid. But as I brought the champagne to my lips, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of my tears. Not tonight, not ever. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, each moment more humiliating than the last. Conversations that stopped mid-sentence when I approached, as if my presence had become somehow contagious. Old family friends who suddenly discovered urgent reasons to examine their phones or refresh their drinks when they saw me walking in their direction. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd known me since I was 5 years old, actually turned her back and walked away when I tried to say hello. Judge Morrison, who'd once praised my debate skills and encouraged me to consider law school, looked right through me as if I were invisible. The social geometry of wealth is precise and unforgiving, and I could feel my complete expulsion from it happening in real time. These people had probably received briefings about the family situation through the efficient gossip networks that connect Connecticut's elite. They knew which side their bread was buttered on, and it wasn't mine. But the cruelest moment came during the gift presentation. Victoria opened envelope after envelope of congratulations and checks, her excitement genuine and infectious as she shared each generous offering with the crowd. Wedding gifts from senators, vacation home loans from family friends, jewelry from distant relatives who wanted to curry favor with the golden couple. Then she picked up a small blue box that I recognized immediately, my contribution, which felt pathetically modest compared to the thousands of dollars worth of gifts surrounding it. "This is from Elena," she announced, holding up the antique sapphire pendant that had belonged to our great-grandmother. I'd spent 6 months having it professionally restored, carefully saving money from my nonprofit salary to pay for the delicate work required to bring it back to its original beauty. The pendant was genuinely valuable, not just monetarily but historically. Great-grandmother Sarah had worn it on her wedding day in 1923, and it had been passed down through the family ever since. I'd chosen it specifically because I thought it would mean something to Victoria, thought it would connect her to our family legacy in a way that mere money couldn't. "How thoughtful," my mother said, her voice carefully neutral as she examined the pendant with the kind of expression usually reserved for examining spoiled food. Though perhaps it would look better on someone who actually appreciates vintage jewelry. The dismissal was surgical in its precision. With a single sentence, she'd managed to minimize my gift, insult my taste, and suggest that I was somehow unworthy of family heirlooms, all while maintaining the appearance of polite commentary. Victoria's cheeks flushed with what might have been embarrassment or guilt. "Mother, please. I'm simply saying that some gifts are more practical than others. I'm sure Elena chose something within her means." Within my means. As if my financial limitations were somehow evidence of personal failure, rather than the natural consequence of choosing meaningful work over maximizing profit. I watched Victoria carefully place the pendant back in its box, setting it aside with the kind of gentle dismissal you'd use for a child's macaroni art. Beautiful in its own way, but not really suitable for display among the serious gifts. That was the moment I felt something inside me shift. Not break, that had already happened. But tilt, like a building settling on an unstable foundation. A fundamental reorientation of how I understood my place in this family, in this world. I stood up then, not dramatically or suddenly, just quietly gathering my small purse and placing my napkin on the table with the kind of careful precision my mother had drilled into me during childhood etiquette lessons. "Leaving so early?" Great Aunt Louise whispered, her eyes full of concern and recognition. She understood what was happening, probably because she'd experienced her own version of family exile decades earlier. "I think I've seen enough," I replied softly, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Thank you for the kind words earlier. They meant more than you know." I walked toward the exit with my head high and my spine straight, every step deliberate and measured. The same posture I'd been taught for walking across stages at school graduations, for entering rooms where I needed to represent the family with dignity and grace. Except this time I was walking away from the family forever. No one stopped me. No one called my name. I passed through the elegant ballroom, past the crystal chandeliers and the carefully arranged flowers, past the faces of people who'd known me since childhood and were now pretending they didn't see me leave. I walked through the front door of my childhood home and knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never be welcome there again. The final nail in the coffin of my identity as a Sinclair daughter had been hammered home in front of 300 witnesses, and there would be no coming back from this kind of public rejection. The valet brought my car without comment, though I caught him glancing at me with something that might have been sympathy. Even the hired help could see that something terrible had just happened to me. As I drove down the long driveway away from the estate, I looked in my rearview mirror and watched the house grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely behind the trees. The house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to walk and talk and read, where I'd dreamed of becoming someone who would make my parents proud. All of it was gone now, erased as completely as if it had never existed. The drive back to my studio apartment in New Haven took 45 minutes, but it felt like a journey between worlds. From the pristine lawns and marble facades of old Connecticut money to the converted warehouse where I'd been living since my parents cut off my trust fund access 3 years ago. The rain started as I pulled into my parking space, a gentle mist that turned the streetlights into halos of amber light. I sat in my car for a long time, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching droplets race down my windshield like tears I refused to shed. The radio was still playing softly, some classical piece that reminded me of the piano lessons Mother had insisted upon when I was 7. "Music is essential for proper development," she'd explained to her friends, as if my childhood were a garden that needed careful cultivation to produce the right kind of flowers. I'd actually loved those piano lessons at first. Mrs. Chen, my instructor, was kind and patient, encouraging my natural inclination toward emotional expression in my playing. But Mother quickly corrected that tendency. "Less feeling, Elena. More precision. We want technical excellence, not melodrama." Technical excellence instead of feeling. The story of my entire childhood. My apartment building had character, which was real estate speak for old and slightly falling apart. The brick facade was weathered and charming in daylight, but at night it looked tired, forgotten. The kind of building where young professionals and graduate students lived when they were trying to make it on their own, without family money smoothing the way. The elevator wheezed to the 4th floor with the reluctant effort of machinery that had been running longer than it should. I fumbled with my keys in the dim hallway, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline or cold or the delayed shock of what had just happened. Inside, my space felt different somehow. The exposed brick walls and hardwood floors that usually felt bohemian and artistic now seemed sparse, inadequate. Like the physical manifestation of being cut out of the family fortune. The morning sunlight that usually made my plants glow green and made me feel hopeful about the day ahead now seemed to highlight everything I didn't have rather than everything I'd chosen. I'd decorated with pieces from flea markets and yard sales, mixed with a few expensive items I'd managed to keep when I moved out of the family home at 22. A Persian rug that had been in my bedroom since childhood, small enough that Mother hadn't noticed when I rolled it up and took it with me. A crystal vase that had belonged to my grandmother, given to me for my 16th birthday before Mother decided that such valuable family heirlooms should stay where they belong. The apartment was small but cozy, with large windows that faced east toward the harbor. On clear mornings, I could see boats moving in the distance, their white sails catching the light like prayers. It wasn't the estate I'd grown up in, but it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned through my own work. They'd cut off my trust fund access 3 years ago, but the transition hadn't been as devastating as they'd probably hoped. I'd been working at the homeless shelter in Hartford, making $38,000 a year and living in a studio that cost half my salary, but I'd been happy. Genuinely happy for the first time in my adult life. The work was hard but meaningful. I helped coordinate services for families who'd lost their homes due to medical bankruptcies, job losses, domestic violence situations that required them to flee with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Every day I met people who were fighting to rebuild their lives from nothing, and their resilience and determination inspired me more than any charity gala or board meeting ever had. But my parents saw my career choice as evidence of mental instability or deliberate rebellion. "Elena's going through a phase," Mother would explain to concerned friends. "She'll come to her senses eventually and join the family business where she belongs." The trust fund had been my grandmother's idea, established when Victoria and I were children with money from her own inheritance, wealth that had come from her father's textile mills in the 1920s. "Every woman needs her own money," she'd told me once when I was 8, pressing a $20 bill into my palm with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing a profound secret. "Never let anyone make you financially dependent, Elena. Independence is the only real security." Grandmother Evelyn had been different from my parents. She'd grown up during the Depression, married a man who'd made his fortune rather than inheriting it, and she understood the value of money in a way that her children and grandchildren never would. She'd lived through uncertainty, had watched wealthy families lose everything overnight, and she'd wanted to make sure Victoria and I would always have something that was ours alone. The trust was supposed to be untouchable until we turned 25, and then we'd each receive annual distributions of roughly $150,000. Enough to live comfortably if we were careful, enough to pursue careers based on passion rather than necessity, enough to give us the kind of independence that money can buy. But somehow, my distributions had stopped coming when I turned 25. The lawyers had explained it as administrative restructuring and changes in the trust documentation, but they'd been vague about the details. I'd been too busy with my work at the shelter to investigate thoroughly, and I'd assumed it was a temporary delay that would be resolved eventually. Now I understood that it hadn't been a delay at all. It had been theft, pure and simple. How naive I'd been, thinking that legal documents and family blood meant something. That love came with protection, that being someone's daughter meant they couldn't simply decide you didn't exist. I changed out of my navy dress and into soft pajamas, the kind of comfortable clothes my mother would have called giving up on yourself. Cotton pants with a drawstring waist and an oversized sweater that I'd bought at a thrift store in college, comfortable, practical clothes that prioritized function over appearance. In the Sinclair family, appearance was everything. Image management was a full-time job that required constant vigilance and significant financial investment. Hair appointments every 6 weeks, professional wardrobe consultations, personal trainers and nutritionists to maintain the kind of physical perfection that photographs well and conveys success. I'd rejected all of that when I moved out, choosing comfort and authenticity over the exhausting performance of wealth. It had felt liberating at first, like taking off shoes that had never quite fit properly. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of my modest life, I felt the weight of what I'd lost. I made tea in my tiny kitchen, using a kettle I'd bought at Target for $12. The ritual was soothing, measuring loose leaves, waiting for the water to boil, the sharp whistle that cut through the silence of my apartment like a reminder that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. My kitchen was barely large enough for one person, with countertops that had been installed sometime in the 1980s and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly. But I'd painted the walls a warm yellow and hung plants in the window, creating the kind of cozy domesticity that money can't buy. The kettle's whistle pierced the silence like a scream I couldn't release, and I realized I'd been standing motionless for several minutes, lost in the endless loop of memories and regrets that trauma creates. That night, I sat on my second-hand couch, a blue sectional I'd found on Craigslist for $300, and did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not pretty tears or dignified sorrow, but the ugly, body-shaking sobs of someone whose last illusion has finally shattered. I cried for the little girl who'd believed her parents loved both daughters equally, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. For the teenager who'd tried so hard to be perfect, to be worthy, to earn the kind of unconditional acceptance that should have been her birthright. For the young woman who'd kept hoping that maybe this time, this achievement, this sacrifice would finally be enough. I cried for the family I'd thought I had and the family I'd actually had. For the difference between love and control, between acceptance and tolerance, between being cherished and being managed. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen, until the box of tissues beside me was empty and the night outside had deepened to that particular shade of black that comes just before dawn. I cried until there were no more tears left, until the hollow ache in my chest had expanded to fill every corner of my body. But by morning, something had shifted. The tears were gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger that felt like looking at the world through perfect glass. The kind of anger that burns clean and bright, that clarifies rather than distorts, that transforms victims into warriors. I made coffee in my French press, a graduation gift from my grandmother that I'd treasured because it had been chosen specifically for me, not because it matched a set or fulfilled a social obligation, and sat at my small dining table as sunlight filtered through my windows. The silence in my apartment wasn't lonely anymore. It was purposeful. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, when the air pressure changes and every animal instinct knows something significant is about to happen. If my parents wanted to play the legacy game, they should have remembered that I'd been there for every board meeting, every family dinner where business was discussed, every supposedly private conversation they'd had about company finances. They trained me to pay attention to details, to spot inconsistencies, to ask the right questions. They just never expected me to use those skills against them. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen and opened my laptop. If my parents wanted to play the legacy game, they should have remembered that I'd been there for every board meeting, every family dinner where business was discussed, every supposedly private conversation they'd had about company finances. The Sinclair Holdings shared drive was still accessible through my college email, a digital oversight from when I'd helped with their website redesign 5 years ago. Typical of my parents to change the locks on my trust fund but forget about cybersecurity. I spent the next 3 days systematically downloading files. Financial records, board meeting minutes, correspondence with investors. What I found was worse than simple nepotism or garden-variety family cruelty. The Guatemala project I'd worked on, the one my parents had publicly criticized as Elena's little charity phase, had been funded by a Sinclair Holdings subsidiary. My work building schools in remote villages had generated substantial tax benefits for the company, something they'd never mentioned when questioning my wasteful career choices. But that was just the beginning. The trust fund my grandmother had established for both Victoria and me contained a very specific clause. The money was to be distributed equally unless one sister formally renounced her claim. Buried in a folder labeled Estate Planning Archive, I found a document with my forged signature doing exactly that. The handwriting was close but not perfect. Whoever had signed my name had made the E in Elena too rounded, too careful. $3 million. Gone with a pen stroke I'd never made. I printed everything, organized it in color-coded folders, and began making phone calls. Elena? The voice of David Chen, my law school roommate's boyfriend, sounded surprised. I haven't heard from you in ages. How are you? I need a lawyer, David. And not for anything simple. The meeting took place in David's modest practice office in downtown Hartford, far from the marble and mahogany where my father conducted his business. David specialized in white-collar crime and corporate fraud, not exactly the family reunion I'd envisioned, but apparently necessary. This is substantial, he said after reviewing my evidence. The forged trust fund document alone is a felony. But Elena, are you sure you want to pursue this? Once you file these papers, there's no going back. I thought about Victoria's face at the engagement party, how she'd looked genuinely uncomfortable during our father's speech. I thought about the sapphire pendant I'd given her, now probably tucked away in a jewelry box with dozens of other expensive gifts. They made their choice, I said. Now I'm making mine. The first article appeared in the Hartford Business Journal 3 weeks later. Sinclair Holdings under investigation for financial irregularities. My name wasn't mentioned, but the company's stock price dropped 12% in 2 days. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating. Connecticut's social circles were small and interconnected, and news traveled fast through the country clubs and charity board meetings where reputation mattered more than truth. My phone started ringing immediately. First the reporters, their voices eager and predatory. Miss Sinclair, can you comment on the allegations against your family's company? I declined every interview, but that didn't stop them from camping outside my apartment building for 3 days. Then came the lawyers, not just David, but attorneys representing other potential victims who'd started coming forward after the initial story broke. Apparently, the Sinclair family's pattern of financial manipulation extended far beyond their own children. Former business partners, charity beneficiaries, even household staff who'd had their retirement funds mismanaged. The most heartbreaking call came from Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been our housekeeper for 15 years before my parents downsized their staff. She'd trusted them to manage her savings, believing that wealthy people must know about money. They'd invested her nest egg in a shell company that existed only on paper, then used her funds to cover losses in other ventures. "I should have known better," she said, her voice thick with shame. "But they were so sure, so confident. And I thought they cared about me." That conversation kept me awake for hours. Mrs. Rodriguez had been like a second mother to Victoria and me, packing our lunches with extra cookies, staying late when we were sick, teaching us Spanish curse words when our parents weren't listening. The idea that my family had stolen from her made me physically nauseous. Then Victoria called. "Elena, we need to talk." Her voice was strained, barely recognizable. "This whole thing is spinning out of control." "Actually, we don't," I replied calmly. "Your parents made it very clear that I'm no longer part of this family." "That's not God, Elena. This is destroying everything. James's family is reconsidering the engagement. The Foundation's board is asking questions. The country club is reviewing our membership status. Can't we work this out privately?" I almost laughed at the irony. "You mean the way our parents worked out my trust fund privately? Or the way they decided my career privately? Or the way they erased me from the family privately?" Silence stretched between us, filled with years of accumulated hurt and willful blindness. I could hear her breathing, could picture her in the same pink bedroom where we'd once shared secrets and promises to always protect each other. "I never wanted this," Victoria whispered finally. "I never asked them to cut you out." "Then you should have said something when it mattered." I tried. "You don't understand what it's like, Elena. The pressure, the expectations. If I didn't perform perfectly, if I showed any weakness, any disloyalty, they'd treat you the way they treated me?" Another long pause. "Yes." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a flicker of sympathy for my sister. She'd been trapped too, just in a prettier cage. "I'm sorry they put you in that position, Vic. But I can't protect you from the consequences of their choices anymore. I can't protect myself." I hung up and turned off my phone. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Corporate fraud cases usually drag on for years, but the evidence was so clear, so well documented, that even my parents' expensive legal team couldn't create much confusion. David worked around the clock, coordinating with federal prosecutors, organizing victim testimony, building an airtight case. He'd taken the case pro bono, partly out of friendship but mostly out of genuine outrage at what the evidence revealed. "It's not just the money," he explained during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "It's the systematic nature of it. They targeted vulnerable people, immigrants, elderly clients, their own children. They used their reputation and social standing as weapons." The forged signature was verified by 3 independent handwriting experts. Each one reached the same conclusion. The document bearing my name had been created by someone else, someone who'd practiced my signature but couldn't quite replicate the specific pressure patterns and letter formations that made it uniquely mine. The financial record showed a clear pattern of improper trust fund management going back years. Money that should have been held in secure accounts had been repeatedly borrowed for risky investments, with no intention of replacement. My parents had essentially been running a Ponzi scheme with their own family's inheritance. Most damning of all, they found other documents. Apparently, my parents had been systematically stealing from various family accounts for years, always careful to target money that wouldn't be immediately missed. Elderly relatives, trust funds for minor cousins, even charity donations that were supposed to go to specific causes. The scope of their betrayal was staggering. This wasn't simple favoritism or even garden-variety financial abuse. This was a criminal enterprise that had operated for decades under the cover of respectability and family loyalty. The trial made national news. Connecticut shipping heiress exposes parents' fraud. The headlines made me cringe. I hated being reduced to a simple story of greed and revenge when the truth was so much more complicated. But I showed up to court every day in my navy blue dress and my grandmother's pearls, and I told the truth. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the grand chambers I'd seen in movies. Fluorescent lighting, beige walls, uncomfortable wooden benches that made long sessions physically painful. But despite its humble appearance, this room would determine the course of my family's future. My parents sat at the defendant's table with their expensive legal team, 3 attorneys from Hartford's most prestigious firm, each billing more per hour than most people made in a week. They maintained their dignity even as witness after witness confirmed the evidence against them, sitting straight-backed and expressionless as their carefully constructed world crumbled around them. Richard wore his best suit, the charcoal gray Armani he'd bought for Victoria's graduation from Harvard. Margaret had chosen a conservative black dress that suggested sorrow and remorse, though her eyes remained cold and calculating throughout the proceedings. They looked like what they'd always been, wealthy people who believed the rules didn't apply to them. They never looked at me directly, not once during the entire proceedings. Even when I was on the witness stand explaining how I discovered the forged documents and traced the missing funds, their eyes remained fixed on their lawyers or on some point just above my head. The prosecution built their case methodically, like assembling a puzzle that had been scattered across years of careful deception. David Chen, my attorney, had worked with the federal prosecutors to create a timeline that showed the pattern of abuse going back more than a decade. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead prosecutor began during opening statements, "this case is about more than money. It's about the systematic abuse of trust by parents who were supposed to protect their children. It's about a pattern of fraud that targeted not just family members, but employees, business partners, and charitable organizations that trusted the Sinclair name." The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers from trust accounts. Forged signatures on documents that transferred ownership of assets without the knowledge of the rightful owners. Tax filings that claimed charitable deductions for donations that were never made, or that were made but the money was quietly returned to family accounts. Mrs. Rodriguez, our former housekeeper, testified about her retirement savings that had been invested without her knowledge. She spoke in heavily accented English, her voice shaking as she described how she'd trusted the Sinclairs to help her save for retirement. "They told me they would make my money grow," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I work for them 15 years. I trust them like family. But they steal from me just like they steal from their own daughter." Her testimony was devastating, not just because of the financial harm she'd suffered, but because it revealed the callous way my parents had exploited someone who'd cared for their children, who'd made their family life possible through her quiet, dedicated service. Other victims came forward during the trial. A former business partner who discovered that his investment in a Sinclair Holdings subsidiary had been diverted to cover losses in other ventures. A charity director who'd learned that donations pledged to her organization had been returned to the Sinclair Foundation's accounts after the tax benefits were claimed. Each testimony painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple family dysfunction. This was criminal behavior that had hurt dozens of people who'd trusted the Sinclair reputation. When it was my turn to testify, I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to Victoria's engagement party, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because it was the only formal outfit I owned that felt appropriate for such a serious occasion. "Miss Sinclair," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the jury about your relationship with your parents?" I took a deep breath and began to tell the story I'd been living for 28 years. The favoritism, the constant criticism, the way I'd been gradually erased from family photos and family history. The forged signature on the trust fund document, the discovery of financial irregularities, the pattern of abuse that I'd finally recognized for what it was. "I loved my parents," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I wanted their approval, their acceptance. I spent years trying to be the daughter they wanted me to be. But they weren't interested in loving me, they were interested in controlling me. And when I refused to be controlled, they decided I was expendable. The defense tried to paint me as a disgruntled daughter seeking revenge, a troubled young woman whose accusations couldn't be trusted. But the financial evidence spoke for itself. The forged documents, the unauthorized transfers, the pattern of theft that spanned years and targeted multiple victims. During cross-examination, my parents' attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Blackwood who'd been representing wealthy Connecticut families for 30 years, tried to shake my testimony. "Miss Sinclair, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment toward your parents since childhood?" "Yes," I replied honestly. I resented being treated as less valuable than my sister. I resented being criticized for career choices that helped people instead of making money. I resented being lied to and stolen from. But resentment didn't forge those documents, Mr. Blackwood. My parents did that themselves. But you admit you had financial motives for bringing these charges? I had justice motives. The financial recovery was secondary to ensuring that other victims got their money back and that my parents couldn't hurt anyone else. Victoria attended the first day of testimony, sitting in the back row with her head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the courtroom. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what she was hearing. I could see her struggling with the cognitive dissonance of learning that her perfect life had been built on other people's suffering. She never came back after that first day. I understood why. Hearing the truth about our family was devastating enough when you'd suspected it all along. It must have been unbearable when you genuinely believed in their goodness. James Worthington's son broke off the engagement 2 weeks into the trial. The news was delivered through their mutual attorney, without explanation or personal communication. The political ramifications of being associated with a family under federal investigation had apparently outweighed whatever feelings he might have had for Victoria. I felt sorry for her then, despite everything. She'd lost her fiancé, her family's reputation, and her carefully constructed worldview all at the same time. The golden girl who'd never faced real adversity was suddenly dealing with the kind of public humiliation that destroys lives. But I couldn't protect her from the consequences of our parents' choices. I'd tried to shield her for years, absorbing their criticism and their cruelty so she wouldn't have to face it. But protection that enables harm isn't really protection at all, it's just delayed justice. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with reporters, family friends, and curious observers who'd been following the case in the local media. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find?" "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of forgery, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendants guilty." Guilty, guilty, guilty. The words echoed in the courtroom like hammer blows. I watched my parents' faces as the verdict was read, looking for some sign of remorse or recognition of the harm they'd caused. But their expressions remained carefully blank, as if this were happening to someone else entirely. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. My parents were each sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to all affected parties, a sum that totaled nearly $8 million when interest and penalties were included. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty, hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning. Justice had been served, but it hadn't healed the deeper wounds or restored the family relationships that had been destroyed by decades of manipulation and abuse. The media attention was intense but brief. Connecticut society had a short attention span for scandals, especially when they involved uncomfortable truths about systemic inequality and the abuse of privilege. Within a month, the story had faded from the headlines, replaced by other dramas and other crises. But emptiness, I learned, can be filled with new things. I used the restitution money to start the Elena Sinclair Foundation, focused on legal aid for family fraud victims. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' crimes funding an organization dedicated to preventing exactly the kind of harm they'd caused. The foundation's first client was a 19-year-old whose stepfather had stolen her college fund. The second was an elderly man whose daughter had forged power of attorney documents. The third was a young mother whose ex-husband had somehow transferred their house into his name alone. Each case reminded me that family betrayal wasn't unique to the wealthy. It cut across every social and economic line, leaving victims who often had nowhere to turn. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor at my new office in downtown Hartford. The Elena Sinclair Foundation had started small, just me, David Chen as legal counsel, and a shared office space in a converted textile building that had seen better days. The rent was affordable, the lighting was good, and the location was convenient for clients who needed to reach us by public transportation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. I'd used the restitution money to start the foundation, focused on legal aid for family fraud victims. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' crimes funding an organization dedicated to preventing exactly the kind of harm they'd caused. But there was something poetic about transforming their legacy of manipulation into a force for justice and healing. The foundation's mission was simple: provide legal representation and support services for people who'd been financially abused by family members. We specialized in cases involving forged documents, stolen inheritances, and the kind of financial manipulation that traditional legal aid organizations weren't equipped to handle. Our first client was a 19-year-old named Ashley whose stepfather had stolen her college fund by forging her signature on withdrawal documents. Her mother had remarried when Ashley was 12, and her stepfather had gradually gained access to the education fund her deceased father had established for her. By the time Ashley graduated high school and tried to access the money for tuition, the account was empty. "No one believes me," Ashley told me during our first meeting, her voice shaking with frustration and betrayal. "They all say family doesn't do that to family. But he did. He stole my future and convinced my mom that I'm lying about it." I understood her pain in a way that surprised me with its intensity. The gaslighting, the isolation, the way family loyalty gets weaponized against victims of family abuse. Ashley's case became personal for me in a way that probably wasn't entirely professional, but it motivated me to fight harder than I might have otherwise. We sued Ashley's stepfather for theft and fraud, using forensic accounting to trace the missing funds and handwriting analysis to prove the forged signatures. The case took 8 months to resolve, but we recovered every penny of Ashley's college money plus interest and legal fees. More importantly, we validated her experience and gave her the tools to protect herself from future financial abuse. The second case was an elderly man named Robert whose daughter had forged power of attorney documents to gain control of his assets while he was recovering from a stroke. She'd sold his house, liquidated his retirement accounts, and moved him into a substandard nursing facility while she spent his life savings on luxury vacations and expensive cars. Robert's case was complicated by his age and the lingering effects of his stroke, which made him an unreliable witness in the eyes of the legal system. But his son Mark had been documenting the abuse for months, gathering bank statements and medical records that proved his sister's exploitation of their vulnerable father. "Dad worked his whole life to build something for his family," Mark told me, tears streaming down his face as he showed me photos of the house his father had lost. "She took everything. She took his dignity, his security, his peace of mind. And when he tried to object, she convinced everyone that he was senile and confused." Financial elder abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in America, partly because victims are often isolated and partly because family members are reluctant to criminally prosecute their own relatives. But the damage is devastating. Elderly victims of family financial abuse often never recover financially or emotionally from the betrayal. We spent 18 months fighting Robert's case, ultimately recovering most of his assets and securing criminal charges against his daughter. But more importantly, we helped him move into a quality assisted living facility where he could live with dignity and security for his remaining years. The third case was a young mother named Carmen whose ex-husband had somehow transferred their house into his name alone during their divorce proceedings. She'd been granted half the marital assets in the divorce decree, but when she tried to sell the house to pay for her children's expenses, she discovered that she no longer legally owned any part of it. Carmen's ex-husband was a lawyer who'd used his knowledge of the legal system to manipulate documents and exploit loopholes in the divorce process. He'd forged her signature on quitclaim deeds and used technicalities in the court filing system to transfer ownership without her knowledge or consent. "I keep thinking I must be crazy," Carmen told me during our initial consultation. "How does someone steal a house? How do you forge documents in broad daylight and no one notices? But every time I call the bank or the title company, they tell me the paperwork is all in order. They act like I'm some confused woman who doesn't understand how property ownership works." Carmen's case took 2 years to resolve because her ex-husband had covered his tracks so thoroughly. We had to hire forensic document experts, challenge the authenticity of multiple legal filings, and essentially reverse engineer a fraud that had been carefully planned and executed over several months. But we won. Carmen got her house back, plus damages for the emotional distress and financial hardship she'd endured. More importantly, her ex-husband faced criminal charges for forgery and fraud, which meant other potential victims would be protected from his schemes. Each case reminded me that family betrayal wasn't unique to the wealthy. It cut across every social and economic line, leaving victims who often had nowhere to turn because the people who'd hurt them were the same people society expected them to trust unconditionally. The foundation grew faster than I'd anticipated. Word spread through social services networks, legal aid organizations, and support groups for abuse survivors. We started getting calls from across New England, then from other states, then from other countries where people had heard about our work through internet forums and social media. By our second year, we had a waiting list of potential clients and a staff of 12 people, including lawyers, social workers, forensic accountants, and victim advocates. We'd recovered over $5 million in stolen assets and helped hundreds of families navigate the complex intersection of legal and emotional abuse. But the most rewarding part of the work wasn't the money we recovered or the criminals we prosecuted. It was the moment when a client realized they weren't crazy, they weren't alone, and they had the right to expect better treatment from their families. Victoria stood in my doorway on a Tuesday afternoon in March, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer outfits. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked younger without her usual armor of perfect makeup and expensive accessories. "The engagement is off," she said without preamble, not bothering with pleasantries or small talk. "James decided the family scandal was too much for his political aspirations." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same one where I'd sat with dozens of clients as they told me their stories of family betrayal and financial abuse. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" She sat down carefully as if the chair might break or reject her. "You never liked him?" "I barely knew him," I replied honestly. "But I'm sorry you're hurt." It was true. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the years of watching her receive the love and support that had been denied to me, I didn't want Victoria to suffer. She was as much a victim of our parents' dysfunction as I was, just in a different way. We sat in silence for a moment, two sisters in a stark office, surrounded by the ruins of everything we'd once called family. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air between us like tiny spirits of all the conversations we'd never had. "I've been going through the house," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Packing up what's left before the bank takes it. I found something I think belongs to you." She pulled out a small wooden box from her purse, hand-carved and worn smooth with age. I recognized it immediately, my grandmother's jewelry box, the one that had disappeared from my room when I was 16. I'd assumed Mother had taken it during one of her periodic reorganizations of my belongings. "Mother had it in her closet," Victoria explained, her eyes fixed on the box rather than my face. "Along with some of your other things. Photo albums, report cards, that ceramic horse you made in pottery class when you were 8. The one Mother said was too childish to display with the rest of our artwork." I reached for the box with trembling hands, running my fingers over the familiar carved roses on the lid. Grandmother Evelyn had given it to me for my 10th birthday, along with her first piece of jewelry, a small gold locket with my baby picture inside. Why are you giving these back now? I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. Victoria's laugh was hollow, bitter, edged with the kind of pain that comes from seeing clearly for the first time. Because I finally understand what they did to you. It wasn't just about the money or the business. They erased you piece by piece, year by year. And I let them. She was right. The systematic erasure had been so gradual, so carefully executed, that I'd almost convinced myself it was normal sibling dynamics. The way my achievements were minimized while Victoria's were celebrated. The way my interests were dismissed as phases while hers were encouraged and funded. The way my photographs were gradually removed from common areas while hers multiplied and grew larger. You were their golden child, I said, not accusingly but as a simple statement of fact. It's not your fault. Isn't it? Her eyes filled with tears that she'd been holding back for months. I knew something was wrong. When you stopped coming to family dinners, when your trust fund payments stopped, when they'd changed the subject every time I asked about you. I knew, and I didn't ask harder questions because it was easier not to. The admission hung between us like a bridge that neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. Victoria had been complicit in my erasure, but she'd also been trapped by the same system that had victimized me. The golden child role came with its own prison, its own impossible standards and constant performance requirements. We can't change the past, Vic, I said, using the childhood nickname I hadn't spoken in years. No, she agreed, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. But maybe we can change what comes next. It took time, months of careful conversations, shared meals in neutral locations, slow rebuilding of trust. Victoria started working with the foundation, using her business skills to help expand our reach. She was good at it, better than I'd expected, and watching her find purpose beyond our parents' expectations was like seeing her truly come alive for the first time. We never became the close sisters we might have been in a different family, but we found something new: respect, understanding, and the beginning of genuine affection. A year after the trial, I stood in the conference room of the Elena Sinclair Foundation, looking out at 20 staff members who were discussing cases, strategies, and the kind of impact we could have with our expanded budget. On my desk sat the wooden jewelry box Victoria had returned, now holding not just my grandmother's jewelry but new pieces, gifts from clients whose cases we'd won, small tokens of gratitude that meant more than any family heirloom. The foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations. We'd helped recover over $2 million in stolen assets, prosecuted dozens of cases of family fraud, and provided legal aid to hundreds of victims who couldn't afford representation. But more than that, we'd created a space where people could speak truth about family betrayal without shame, where survivors could find resources and support instead of judgment and disbelief. My parents were released from federal prison after 18 months, but they never contacted me. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd moved to Florida, living quietly on what remained of their assets after restitution and legal fees. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about what they'd lost, not just the money or the prestige, but the daughter who'd loved them despite everything, who'd spent years hoping for their approval and acceptance. But mostly I didn't think about them at all. On quiet Sunday mornings in my new apartment, a bright 2-bedroom space with tall windows and room for bookshelves, I'd sit with coffee and the newspaper, reading about other people's dramas and feeling grateful for the peace I'd found. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, of choices made freely, of relationships built on truth instead of obligation. Victoria would text sometimes, sharing pictures from her new job at a nonprofit in Boston, updates about her therapy progress, or just random thoughts about our shared but separate journey toward healing. Saw an article about family scapegoating, she wrote one morning. Made me think of you. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. We see it now, I texted back. That's what matters. And it was true. The past couldn't be changed, the lost years couldn't be recovered, the family we'd been couldn't be salvaged. But the family we chose, the staff at the foundation who'd become like siblings, the clients who'd become friends, the sister who'd finally found her own voice, that family was real, honest, and built to last. Some stories of family betrayal end in permanent estrangement, with wounds that never heal and bridges that can never be rebuilt. Others end in false reconciliation, with victims forced to pretend forgiveness they don't feel for the sake of peace that isn't real. Mine ended differently, with justice served, truth acknowledged, and the radical act of building something new from the ashes of what was lost. I learned that family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart, who tells you the truth even when it hurts, and who stands beside you as you rebuild your life from scratch. The Sinclair name still opens doors in Connecticut, just not for me anymore. And that's perfectly fine. I'd rather build my own doors than walk through ones that were never truly open anyway. Sometimes the greatest gift your family can give you is the clarity that comes from their final, irrevocable betrayal. It hurts like nothing else ever will. But it also frees you to become exactly who you were meant to be. And freedom, I've learned, is worth every sacrifice required to claim it. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own truth? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences might help someone else feel less alone in their journey.